Hello, my name is Isadora Neroni Rezende and I am a PhD candidate of the Law Science and Technology PhD program. In this video, I will present the preliminary results of my doctoral thesis focusing on smart city surveillance. Firstly, I will provide an overview of my thesis and then give some hints at some specific issues that I've been working on recently. I will analyze privacy expectations that citizens can claim to have in public IoT environments, and then I will present general surveillance frameworks that can help us to characterize surveillance initiatives in smart cities. Finally, I will point out to some research outputs and future work. My thesis investigates how surveillance technologies can be implemented in a legally compliant and ethically acceptable way in smart cities. The argument behind my research is that the advent of the Internet of Things has made surveillance, even more extended regimes, a necessary feature of mature information societies, but their concrete implementation warrants a much more granular methodology in assessing proportionality, which is something that I tried to propose in my research. After setting the stage in an introductory chapter, I go through general data protection issues that are recurrent in the smart city context, and then I analyze privacy expectations in public IoT environments. I then look at general surveillance frameworks that have been used or could be used in the future to assess the legitimacy of monitoring initiatives in smart cities, and then building on that, I apply these insights to specific instances of surveillance technologies that are used in the urban environment, such as facial recognition, drones, nudging, or environmental policing. From now on, I will dedicate the last period of my research to data governance frameworks for the smart cities, and this analysis will include a preliminary appreciation of the latest proposals of the EU digital strategy. A first step in assessing the legitimacy of surveillance initiatives in smart cities is to look at privacy expectations in public IoT environments. Notably, the concept of reasonable expectation of privacy has been devised by the United States Supreme Court. From a European perspective, instead, the concept of reasonable expectation of privacy has not been well characterized in the jurisprudence of the court. So, starting with a quantitative search in the Hudok database, I selected 26 decisions in which the court has applied the concept of reasonable expectation of privacy and identified 4 different clusters: surveillance in the workplace, surveillance in public places, surveillance in online environments, mainly referred to digital investigations, and in dissemination of information to journalists. After critically reviewing these decisions, I stressed several inconsistencies in the approach of the court. For instance, it is not clear whether the test should be applied as an overarching test comprising multiple sub-factors, or is it just one factor among many in assessing whether Article 8, the right to private life, should apply beyond the boundaries of the home. Although the test is mostly applied pursuant to the first paragraph of Article 8, so to establish the applicability of this fundamental right, sometimes it is also mentioned in the necessity test under the second paragraph of Article 8. So its real function in the jurisprudence of the court is not clear as well. On the other side, I identified several sub-factors that are recurrent in the jurisprudence of the court in establishing the level of privacy expectations. These include the relevant regulatory framework, for instance, legal rules or ethical principles and socially acceptable norms, but also the targets of the surveillance, for instance, the vulnerability. The means of the surveillance are not associated by a heavy weight in the assessment of the court, compared, for instance, to the further use that is made of collected data. And the place and time of the surveillance also bears some kind of significance in the assessment of privacy expectations made by the court. But how does this all apply in the smart city context? So, to me, The reasonable expectation of privacy test should be conceived as a first step in balancing, a preliminary proportionality test that should tell us whether the necessity test under the second paragraph of Article 8 should bear a more strict or a light character. This, from a methodological perspective, would allow us to achieve more granular proportionality assessment. Some criticalities, however, can be spotted in the approach of the court. For instance, in the past, the court has applied the public activity exception, thus excluding the applicability of a reasonable expectation of privacy to applicants that had participated voluntarily to activities belonging to the public sphere. That is, for instance, public political demonstrations, which in turn could frustrate the weight of other fundamental rights, such as the freedom of thought and association. On the other hand, it seems also that the court applies a very strict notion of identifiability, mainly tied to civil identity, which would exclude the applicability of Article 8 to many other surveillance initiatives that do not rely to this kind of identifiers. So this probably downsizes the importance of the approach of the court in this matter in the context of smart cities, and I argue for a more extensive approach on the matter. With regard to general surveillance frameworks, the latest jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights seems to move towards an acceptance of unfettered regimes of surveillance and data collection, while still paying more attention to how such systems are concretely operationalized. However, especially in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, proportionality assessment of such surveillance regimes may be watered down by an holistic appreciation of the provided safeguards, whereby gaps in the protection may be compensated by other more sound safeguards of the very same surveillance scheme. On the brighter side, the two courts seem to have introduced a more granular understanding of legitimacy goals justifying interferences on the right to private life, which in turn may open the way to more attuned proportionality assessments of surveillance. However, several inconsistencies may stand in the way of such an approach. Concepts of national security and public security are indeed underdefined and often overlapping, subject to contradicting definitions in the doctrine but also in EU law. Broader definitions of national security also include the notion of the protection of the environment, but its weight and possible implications have not been yet explored by the European Court of Human Rights, although some insights could be drawn by the case law of the Court of Justice. National security may also include the integrity of essential services and strategic industries, which in turn may be associated with the overall economic well-being of the country, one of the public interest goals mentioned in Article 8.2 of the Convention. And yet, the weight of such legitimacy goals is still unclear in the case law of the two supranational courts, and this could pose problems in the smart city. One example, above all, is the protection of critical infrastructure, which is consistently framed as a national security objective, especially in light of its increasing digitization, also thanks to the IoT, but is only framed as a public security need under EU law. A general assessment of the surveillance case law allowed me to spot also a lack of precision in the terminology and taxonomy of surveillance interferences. Although the expression mass surveillance is quite recurrent in the case law and public discourse, there is actually no specific understanding of when surveillance can actually be defined as mass. In my research, I decided to gravitate towards a definition that takes into account the nature of the selecting criteria for the collected information, rather than the means to concretely carry on the surveillance. I was also able to characterize surveillance as a continuum, identifying 4 types of surveillance regimes. From mass surveillance, which has neither geographically nor subjective limitation, we go to mass hybrid surveillance, which has not subjective criteria, but it's geographically restrained. We then move to the spectrum of targeted surveillance with hybrid targeted surveillance, which is carried out in open environments, although geographically circumscribed and targeted to predefined individuals. At the very extreme, we also find targeted surveillance, which is performed on specific devices and targeted to predefined individuals as well. This is a list of past research outputs and future work, and with this, I thank you for your attention.